March 3rd, 2026, just last week, a Florida state prison. Billy Leon Kearse had only hours left to live. At 54 years old, he'd spent the last 35 years on death row, longer than he'd lived free. His last meal had been served, his final statement prepared. Think about that for a moment. 35 years. That's more than 3 decades waiting to die for a crime committed when he was barely out of high school. But how did an 18-year-old end up here? On November 28, 1991, during what should have been a routine traffic stop, that teenager made a split-second decision that would change everything. 13 shots fired, 1 police officer dead, 2 lives destroyed in a matter of seconds. Today we're taking you inside the execution of Billy Leon Kearse, from the deadly traffic stop that sealed his fate, to 35 years on death row, to his final moments on earth. This is the Execution Files. Billy Leon Kearse was born in 1972 and grew up in Fort Pierce, Florida. Little is publicly known about his early childhood, but by his teenage years, the warning signs were already emerging. Kearse ran with a rough crowd. He was involved in petty crimes, nothing that predicted the extreme violence he'd soon be capable of, but enough to show a pattern of poor judgment and bad decisions. By the time he turned 18, Kearse stood at a critical juncture. Legally, he was an adult, but neurologically, he was still very much a teenager. Here's what science tells us. The frontal lobe of the brain, the part responsible for judgment, impulse control, and understanding consequences, doesn't fully develop until the mid-20s. At 18, that crucial part of Kearse's brain was still under construction. He existed in that dangerous space between adolescence and adulthood, with all the impulsivity and underdeveloped decision-making that comes with it. This isn't an excuse, it's context, because that impulsivity, that inability to fully grasp consequences, would prove catastrophic on a November night in 1991. November 28, 1991, a routine night in Fort Pierce, Florida. Sergeant Parrish was on patrol. At 40 years old, he was an experienced officer, the kind who'd seen it all, who knew how to handle tense situations, who'd conducted countless traffic stops without incident. He was respected by his colleagues, devoted to his community, and a dedicated family man with a wife and children waiting for him at home. That night, when he pulled over a vehicle for what should have been a standard traffic stop, behind the wheel was 18-year-old Billy Leon Kearse. What happened next transformed a routine encounter into a tragedy that would haunt Fort Pierce for decades. Instead of complying with Sergeant Parrish's instructions, instead of handing over his license and registration like thousands of people do every single day, Kearse made a different choice. He pulled out a firearm, and then came the shots. If you're thinking he fired once in panic, maybe twice in desperation, you'd be wrong. What Kearse did that night went far beyond a moment of fear or a single impulsive action. He shot Sergeant Parrish 13 times. 13 times. This wasn't panic. This wasn't an accidental discharge. This was sustained, deliberate, deadly force. Each pull of the trigger was a conscious choice, a choice to keep firing, to keep killing, long past any point of self-defense or escape. Sergeant Parrish died on that roadside, his life ended by a teenager who couldn't see past the next few seconds. He left behind a wife who'd never see her husband again, children who'd grow up without their father, fellow officers who'd lost more than a colleague, they'd lost family. Parrish had dedicated his career to protecting the Fort Pierce community. He was the kind of officer who made people feel safe, who showed up every day to serve, who understood that even routine traffic stops require professionalism and care. His murder sent shockwaves through Fort Pierce. One of their own, a protector, a neighbor, a friend, had been gunned down during a routine stop. 13 shots. Think about that for a moment. Have you ever made a split-second decision you couldn't take back? The difference between impulse and consequence can be measured in seconds. Share your thoughts in the comments. The Fort Pierce Police Department mobilized immediately. When one of their own is murdered, every available resource gets deployed, every lead gets followed, every piece of evidence gets analyzed, and the evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses came forward. Ballistic analysis confirmed the 13 shots fired. Forensic evidence from the scene painted a clear picture. The traffic stop itself had been documented. There was a timeline, a record, an undeniable chain of events leading from a routine stop to a murdered officer. Within a short time, Billy Leon Kearse was arrested and charged with first-degree murder of a law enforcement officer. In Florida, this is one of the most serious charges in the criminal code. Killing a police officer in the line of duty carries special weight, reflects the unique danger law enforcement faces, and demands the highest level of accountability. During his arrest and interrogation, Kearse showed little remorse for what he'd done. He offered no compelling explanation for why he'd fired 13 times at an officer simply doing his job. For the Fort Pierce Police Department, this wasn't just a case. It was personal. They were determined to get justice for Danny Parrish. The trial was emotionally charged from the start. Cases involving murdered police officers always are. The courtroom fills with uniforms, with grief, with a community demanding answers. The prosecution presented their case methodically. Forensic evidence placed Kearse at the scene. Ballistic analysis accounted for all 13 shots. Witness testimony filled in the gaps. The timeline was clear, the facts undeniable. Then came the testimony that would break hearts throughout the courtroom. Sergeant Parrish's family took the stand, describing the husband and father they'd lost, the void his death had created in their lives. Fellow officers spoke about the man they'd served alongside, his dedication, his professionalism, the way he'd made their department and community better simply by being part of it. The defense faced an impossible task. They couldn't argue innocence. The evidence wouldn't allow it. Instead, they focused on Kearse's age. He was 18, they argued, still developing. His brain wasn't fully formed. This youth should be a mitigating factor, something that might spare him from the ultimate punishment. But the prosecution had powerful counterarguments. A law enforcement officer had been killed in the line of duty. 13 shots demonstrated not panic, but sustained intent. The extreme violence spoke for itself. The jury deliberated and returned with their verdict, guilty on all counts. During the penalty phase, they weighed everything. His youth against the brutality, his underdeveloped brain against 13 deliberate shots. The aggravating factors outweighed the mitigation. The death sentence was imposed on the 18-year-old. At 18, Kearse was legally an adult, but science tells us his brain wasn't fully developed. Does this matter when it comes to such extreme violence? What do you think? Well, let us know below and subscribe to the Execution Files for more cases that challenge our understanding of justice. Billy Leon Kearse would spend 35 years on death row, one of the longest stretches in Florida history, from age 18 to age 54. Think about that timeline. He spent more time waiting to die than he'd spent living free. His entire adult life existed within the confines of a cell, going through the endless appeals process that defines capital punishment in America. Throughout those decades, Kearse maintained a relatively low profile. There was no dramatic spiritual transformation, no becoming a jailhouse advocate or author. He simply waited, filing appeals through his attorneys, challenging procedures, attempting to overturn his sentence. And while he waited, the world outside changed. Brain development research evolved significantly during Kearse's time on death row. Scientists confirmed what was suspected in 1991, that adolescent brains aren't fully formed until the mid-20s. This research led to landmark legal reforms, including the Supreme Court's decision to abolish the death penalty for anyone under 18. But Kearse had been 18 when he pulled that trigger, just outside these protections by a matter of months. The agonizing slowness of capital punishment became its own form of torture. For Kearse, decades of waiting. For the Parrish family, 35 years of grief interrupted by appeals, hearings, and legal proceedings that kept reopening their wounds. The psychological toll was immeasurable on both sides. March 3rd, 2026. 35 years after that November night, execution day finally arrived. In his final hours, Kearse met with spiritual advisors and his legal team. His last meal was documented, simple, unremarkable, given the gravity of what was about to happen. Then came his final statement. After 35 years of relative silence, facing the end of his life, Kearse acknowledged his crime. He offered an apology to the Parrish family for the pain he'd caused, for the life he'd taken, for the decades of grief they'd endured. Were these words genuine remorse, or simply what a dying man says? We'll never truly know. Kearse was led to the execution chamber and strapped to the gurney. The lethal injection protocol was administered. At 54 years old, Billy Leon Kearse was pronounced dead. Outside the prison, supporters of the Parrish family gathered, some who had waited all 35 years for this moment. The family released a statement. While nothing could bring back Sergeant Danny Parrish, while the loss would never heal completely, justice had finally been served. One of Florida's longest death penalty cases was closed, but the cost had been measured in decades. The Billy Leon Kearse case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about decisions, consequences, and the irreversible nature of violence. The most fundamental lesson: split-second decisions can destroy lives, not just the victims, but your own. In the seconds it took Kearse to fire 13 shots, he ended Sergeant Parrish's life and sealed his own fate for the next 35 years. Youth and impulsivity help us understand what happened that night. Brain science explains why an 18-year-old might not fully grasp consequences, but understanding isn't the same as excusing. Just 18 still means legal accountability. The law draws a line, and Kearse was on the adult side of it, barely, but definitively. One moment of violence rippled across decades. Sergeant Danny Parrish never came home from his shift. His family grieved for 35 years, wading through endless appeals. His fellow officers lost a brother. Fort Pierce lost a protector. The case also reveals the staggering cost of our death penalty system: 35 years of legal proceedings, of keeping someone on death row, of keeping wounds open for families on both sides. Kearse went from an 18-year-old with an underdeveloped brain to a 54-year-old man who'd spent his entire adult life in a cell. Sergeant Parrish never got to see his children grow up, never got to retire, never got another day. My Billy Leon Kearse's case reminds us that one moment can define an entire life, for victim and perpetrator. The choices we make, especially in our youth, matter more than we realize. If this story impacted you, share it to raise awareness. What lessons do you take from this tragedy? Join the conversation below, and remember to like and subscribe to the Execution Files for stories that matter. Sergeant Danny Parrish dedicated his life to protecting the Fort Pierce community. He deserves to be remembered, not just as a victim, but as a husband, a father, a devoted officer who showed up to serve every single day. November 28, 1991. 13 shots, 35 years. 2 lives ended, one on a roadside, one in an execution chamber. Their stories deserve to be remembered.